Am I supposed to start?
Just
Okay.
Brad Pitt is from.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Are we ready?
All right.
With my parents.
Wait a minute.
1, 2, 3.
Okay, our group decided to look at roommate relations between international students and domestic students on campus. So we kind of, I forget which one of us first brought up the idea, but we all kind of jumped on it and we all came at it from different perspectives. A lot of us had like floor mates or suite mates, or Brett's an RA, so he's like had residents on his floor who were international students, and we've all noticed kind of how the perceived views of international students or the perceived views of domestic students weren't really how, like, the actuality of it, of the situation. So we wanted to kind of gauge an understanding of how students who have lived with, either if you are international and you have lived with domestic students, view it, versus how if you've never lived with it, and vice versa. So yeah, we were trying to focus on the action continuum goal of understanding self and others.
And especially from my perspective as a commuter, I wanted to know that I've never actually lived on campus.
So we predicted that there would be tension based on individuals' previous socializations, and we were curious to see whether or not stereotypes affected the views of international and domestic students as roommates.
So the goals of our project was to assess the current campus climate views of domestic international student living, and then create opportunities for dialogue based on the result of the survey that we sent out, to see how potential negative views on the topic could be changed on the SLU community. So we had 3 main actions in our project. One was a survey that was successfully created and sent out to over 200 people. And it was a 3-part survey. It was a domestic student who has lived with an international student, an international student who has lived with a domestic student, and then the 3rd part is neither, and just how you feel you would act if you live with the other. The 2nd part was video interviews, which were not anonymous like the survey. And then 3rd was a dialogue over the results. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, so we were not able to hold a accurate dialogue over the survey results.
And with the videos, all the people that were interviewed had their permission. They were totally down with saying their names and everything, made sure that they were clear what was happening before interviewing them. But I'm sorry if I sound funny.
What's your name?
My name is Mark Castella.
What is your race or ethnicity?
Italian American.
Where did you live with your international student?
Privilege.
Where was your international roommate from?
From Holland and from China.
Did you have any reservations about living with a student from another country?
Yes.
Why?
Holland because I didn't know anything about Holland, and China because I knew he probably wouldn't speak English.
Do you think the way that you were socialized as a kid translated into how you viewed your roommates?
With the Chinese roommate, yes. With the Dutch roommate, nobody cares about the Netherlands.
Do you think that your opinions of them changed as the semesters progressed?
Yeah, definitely.
Do you have a different outlook on living with international students now?
Yes.
If you could do it again, would you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye.
What is your name?
My name is Eduardo Cantu.
Where are you from?
I'm from Mexico.
What's your race or ethnicity?
Mexican.
Where are you currently living?
I live in Pews.
Do you live with a domestic or international student?
I live with a domestic student from Indiana, Bloomington.
Did you have any preconceived ideas of what it would be like to live with a domestic student?
Yes, I thought it was going to be really hard to adapt to each other. Having a guy from Mexico and a guy from the States trying to live together was going to be hard, but at the end, it ended up being a good thing.
Do you think you had those ideas because of how you were socialized growing up outside of the United States?
I had those ideas because of difference in culture, different beliefs. People act differently depending on the culture, so that's why I had those ideas.
Are things working out for you too?
Yes, they're great.
Excellent. Thank you.
What is your name?
Timmy.
Where are you from?
I'm from China.
Where do you live on campus?
Fuse,
Do you live with a domestic or an international student?
domestic.
Did you have any reservations about living with a domestic student?
Resolution?
Did you have any concerns?
Oh, no, I don't have any concern because I stayed with the American family for 2 years. So there's nothing much I really concerned about the lifestyle and everything.
Do you think before you lived with an American family for 2 years, you had some concerns about it?
Oh, yeah, because our culture is so different.
How are things working out now with your roommate?
It's pretty good. We get along and we can have a lot of good conversations.
If you could do it again, would you live with a domestic student or would you choose to live with an international student?
Well, it doesn't matter, really. Both are good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So how did or didn't we meet our goals? We did successfully send out the survey to gauge roommate relations and campus views. As stated, we had, I think, 206 responses total. Unfortunately, it took time to get the survey passed through SGA. That was the outlet that we used. So we only kept the survey up for 2 days. It was quite controversial because people thought that it was only for domestic students. So we had some lashback on that we had to work with. But as we said, we interviewed the different individuals. And then we planned to potentially host a dialogue. We couldn't get the results back in time. But on the next slide, it shows ways that we can and will be trying to implement this on SLU's campus. One of those is open door dialogues in Marquette Towers. In Marquette, we do these open door dialogues where we talk about current issues. And so I could show this to my staff and be like, this is what's happening on campus. And then hold those dialogues with residents who live in the halls. Second is an SGA dialogue on the campus climate. And then a dialogue involving international student services and housing residents' life. I've been a part of these dialogues before. Didn't go well. There's a lot of tension. So I think this will be a way to bring more opinions to the matter. And then with the diversity leadership cabinet dialogue.
So the total number of students that were, we had to cap it was 206 student responses. We had a huge number of responses from Greece, Reinhardt, Marquette. And then off the 206, 192 were domestic and only 14 were international. I think that was due to some confusion about whether this was geared towards domestic versus international or everyone on campus. And out of the 206, 183 had not lived with an international student, and then 23 had. So of the people who had lived with an international student, it was mostly 50-50 if you can see going through the three charts. About half of them knew their roommate prior to living with them, and half of them did not. Hanging out with them, hanging out with their international student, half of them did, half of them didn't, and half of them thought that there were significant differences between the cultures, and half of them thought there weren't. And of the students who had actually lived with the international students, almost, if you can see over here, there was only 0 responses who thought that it was negative. Everyone thought it was a positive outcome of living with an international student. And then about 16, well, you can say about, about 70% said that the experience bettered their SLU experience, and about 30% said it didn't. And then of the students who had not lived with international students, I'll explain in the next few graphs how the cycle of socialization affected that. And basically, if you look at this, we had a number chart, whatever, to what's the word? I'm losing words.
It was like a scale.
Scale.
We had
That's
a
the word.
scale with a variety of different questions ranging from 1 to 5. So that if you were like indifferent, there was always that 3 option, but the scale wasn't too big. And the questions sort of varied on how you thought different aspects of culture and of who you are, your different social aspects, would affect the way you view different things.
So like friends, it didn't really matter. It didn't. So it was about 60% of the students said their views of their friends didn't affect how they viewed international students. But this graph over here shows that how stereotypes affected views of international students, and you can see it's not quite low, but there are a few people who voted saying that stereotypes did affect, and that goes back to the cycle of socialization affecting our views of other people. And then similarly, racial bias, thankfully 0%, no one said that racial bias was there. And then one thing was that international students' home country affected the review. So yeah, going back to the aspect of how psychosocialization affects certain points.
Before you, so the other thing is those questions, we recognize that people aren't really going to say, yes, my racial biases affect how I view international students. But that was kind of something we were looking for in asking those questions. We had quite a few, I mean, I don't want to make generalizations, but quite a few pretty ignorant comments with racial bias when we asked for we asked like these yes or no and scale questions, but we also asked a lot of open-ended questions. So I'm going to go through a couple of just like the themes within the responses. But it was really interesting how a lot of the students who had pretty offensive comments said that they didn't have racial biases, they weren't taking stereotypes into any consideration. So when we asked students who said they would want to live with an international student if they hadn't previously, the general themes were it's awesome learning about a different culture. Basically, it would be a good experience because they would be gaining more cultural awareness, broader perspectives of the world. They said that, it was interesting because a lot of people said that their friends' experiences hadn't influenced them, but then a lot of the comments were like, my friend had a really poor experience, there were language barriers, it was just a lot of different, people weren't recognizing that their friends' responses influenced the way that they saw international students. One comment was, I realize that all international students are not like this and that this is an extreme case, but it still affects the way that I view international students. And that's kind of the theme we saw throughout the comments, was that people were saying my friend and his or her roommate had a bad experience, and that's how they generalized all international students as being. It wasn't, they interviewed all people who had international students. It was one bad experience. They defined that as the experience of everyone living with an international student. And a lot of comments were that, for example, when I think international student, I profile them as not being able to speak English, and I wouldn't be comfortable with a roommate who I couldn't talk to. That was a huge theme, was everyone assumed that international students would be a huge language barrier and that they wouldn't be able to communicate with their roommates. So that was just another theme throughout the responses. And then so a lot of the responses were very just like, you could see the socialization and the generalizations being made. We also had a few like very, very offensive comments, but kind of, should I read it now?
Maybe during into questions.
Okay. We'll move on and then we'll get back to them.
It's okay, I think we covered it.
Reflection. So our individual reflections. I enjoyed the project because I got to work on the whole different questions and figure out where to put them and how to phrase. Well, not really phrase them, but like figure out how the survey would be. I was amazed at the results. At I could like literally, as I mentioned through the charts and stuff, you could see the psychosocialization apparent in some of the aspects of the graphs. And then like Samantha will talk about the quote. That kind of shocked me.
As with everyone else, I really enjoyed the project. It was cool to see the comments and how people viewed the other. I was shocked with one of the results because it showed that people preferred not to live with an international student and domestic with another survey that we had, but when they did actually live with the other, it was awesome and no one said it was negative. So it was interesting to see like the reality and what's perceived is the reality do not mesh here.
Yeah, so like Brett said, I'll reiterate, I enjoyed the project. I really enjoyed interviewing the different people that I knew who had experiences with international students. I really wanted to interview this one group of residents on my floor who his international student doesn't speak very good English, and so they're having a little bit of a barrier just to see how that relationship worked. But it was interesting talking to like my friend Mike because he did have a great experience for a semester with his roommate from Holland, and they're still like best friends. They talk all the time. But when his roommate from China moved in, culturally it was completely different. He did believe socially that his roommate would not be able to speak very good English. He didn't. So that was really interesting for me to sort of see and watch and see how it played out, like with the residents on my floor. I'm actively like watching how the international students and the domestic students go together and how they blend and the friends they're making. So that was really interesting for me to talk to them about and to have that open dialogue with them.
Okay, I'll just really quickly wrap up. So I appreciate the opportunity. As Brett touched on, we sent this survey out through all of the residential senators in SGA and also the international student senators. And so everyone who lives on campus or is an international student, almost everyone received the survey and had the opportunity to fill it out. So it wasn't just like our groups of friends, it was objective. I was shocked by, like I said, the themes of, associating one experience with the experiences of everyone. And I was, like Brett said, interested in the differences between people who haven't lived with the quote-unquote other and those who have. And those who actually had lived with an international students and domestic or vice versa said it was a really positive experience.
Group dynamics, we were kind of confused about this. I personally thought it was about like how we work as individual people, and then Brett thought it was more racially based, like how our backgrounds affected it. So we kind of answered it in our own way. Working together, we all worked together, and we split the work. Like everyone who did something good in that aspect did that job, and everyone used their individual strengths for the success of the overall project. In conclusion.
Okay, really quickly, because I know we're in questions. This is just a quote from the International Student Handbook, and it talks about how it's for international students coming in, talking about how they'll get to learn about new cultures, it'll be such a positive experience to interact with students, it'll strengthen your school experience, and I just thought that was interesting based on the perceptions of American students and how a lot of them, the majority of them, didn't want to live with international students. So there's just kind of this disconnect of what we want it to be, what we want these roommate relationships to be, and what they actually are. And so that's what we're hoping in the future to set up platforms for dialogue.
Questions?
Could you read some of the offensive comments?
Bad stuff.
Yeah, so the one that was like, I was just so disgusted, I don't even really want to read it, but it was just in the box of like any additional comments. Someone said, "I'm afraid that if I leave this comment, people may take it the wrong way, but I want to be honest. I am wary of people who are from the Middle East. As a person who is from New York, this is because of 9/11. I'm not sure if I'm the only person to feel this way, but if I was to be assigned to a person who is from the Middle East, then I would feel uncomfortable rooming with them. I understand that this may look very ignorant and not very open-minded, but it's the truth. A family member of mine was lucky enough to not be in their office that morning on 9/11, because then they would have been dead." And it was interesting because, so if we looked at their other responses, they said that racial biases didn't affect them, they had no stereotypes, their personal beliefs were not played into how they viewed international students, and it was just, I don't know. And then another thing that was that one of the questions, if it was after answering another series of questions that led them to the question, like if they said they didn't know any international students, weren't friends with them, et cetera, and it was, why do you think that you aren't friends with international students? And a lot of them, the answers were kind of like very defensive, like, oh, I don't have international student friends, but I have friends from Germany and Italy and stuff, but they've lived in America. And so it was kind of this generalization that if you have groups from friends from different races or ethnicities, like they were just lumping it in a group of like diversity along with international students. Like those it was completely irrelevant information, but it was almost like students had to prove that they weren't racist or biased by saying, oh, well, I have friends from other countries. So yeah.
This is just a statement. I had an international student my sophomore year, but my freshman year and the other half of the semester I lived on campus. I only lived with him a semester though. So I had different, like my freshman year I had a Sri Lankan and an Irish Catholic, but they were both American. And then the first part of my sophomore year I had all Irish Catholic, white. And then I lived with my international roommate who was from China. And for me, I experienced, because we had so many similarities and like cultural dissonance, more dissonance with my American roommates than I did with my Chinese roommate, because my Chinese roommate was so respectful that every time we had a problem, it was like we sat down and we had dinner and we talked about our problems. My other roommates, all the other roommates I had been rats. Like, they burned down my house. Like, I don't know. So for me, it's like, it's not an issue of them being international. It's an issue of somebody not being comfortable with confronting something different.
You go ahead.
Like, do you ask some question about like roommates bring like their girlfriend or
We,
boyfriend back and have like some sexual action?
we did have there was a glitch in our survey that we weren't aware of to the results, which is why it's focused so heavily on what domestic students say, and that's because apparently it all said into it if you lived with an international roommate. But we had I think International Student Services last year did a survey very similar to this that was focused solely on international students' views of domestic students. So in those results, it shows that that's something that's very common with domestic students bringing back a boyfriend and girlfriend, and how that really messed with roommate issues.
Yeah, I know, like, you know, I have a few friends, they're girls, even boys, like, move out because, like, the noise or other things, like, I have a good friend, he was a male, like, one night he was sleeping, he said his roommate's girlfriend's friend, is a girl, ran into his room naked and drunk, so he was really shocked. So and he moved out. Like,
And the interesting thing with that too is Mike Costello, who's in the interview. He actually, both him and his roommate from China both had very serious girlfriends, like they're both still together, and they both had that similar issue with each other. They never resolved it. But Mike was like, yeah, like Huey's roommate, Huey and his girlfriend are always in there, like me and Tori can't be in there, all this stuff. But they, unlike TK and his roommate, who can talk about it, because I think part of it was because there was such a language barrier that they just kind of like tried to avoid the topic altogether.
And to respond to your question, so we did have, in the results of our survey, like Brett said, it was heavily like domestic students responding. And because of that, Leslie reached out to, was it the director of housing?
Associate
The
director.
assistant director, yeah. And so they sent us their results from a few years ago, interviewing solely international students. So we kind of had wanted to balance out our feedback. And a lot of the international student responses as to why they didn't enjoy their experience living on campus were about disrespectful roommates, listing a lot of similar experiences as Ray just did, and also about Americans being too noisy.